This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Hansen. Thurley, Ruxton by Philip Verrill Mighels. Chapter 3. A College Widow. The house where Thurley made her home was a boarding place exclusively for women. The building itself had once been a fine dwelling in a fashionable quarter of the town. The quarter had, however, long since been deserted by the more exclusive set, now gone to an avenue of gold. The property had come by descent to the ownership of Mrs. Prue and Lavinia Legree. Both spinsters, grey of hair, but of admirable disposition, in the care of whom half a dozen young women, including Thurley Ruxton, had flourished in exceptional comfort. Tonight, as she let herself in at the door, Thurley crept to the stairs like a robber. She could not bear to meet the various inmates of the place and have them read her story in her face. She fled to her room without a sound, slipped in, locked the door, and then stood swaying, with her eyes tightly closed and one hand pressed upon her bosom. It was over, all of it, over and gone, and she, the proud, untouched by the rouge of mere flirtation, after months of exceptional popularity with all its attendant temptations, she, no less than the weakest of her sex, was the merest college widow after all. A wave of mortification submerged her at the thought. A college widow, another of the wretched abandoned amusements with which the town was tragically populated. A college widow. The name itself was ribaldry, a scornful derision that would raise a smile to the lips of countless students still to come, who in turn would flirt, awaken love, and finally depart, leaving another college widow in their course. And even yet it was not her pride that was wounded most, not yet, despite this outcome that she felt so detestably degrading. Her love had gone deeper than her pride, and in this she suffered shame and poignant anguish. She had loved him so completely, so joyously, with all her strong young nature. She had loved him this evening, out in the sunset glow, with a new, sweet sense of surrender, which it seemed he must almost have felt and understood. She had loved him so trustfully, dreaming her dreams, that now, with revulsions engulfing all her soul, she was rendered fairly faint with changed emotions. She groped her way to the couch at last and fell on it in a mood of anger, despair, and humiliation. She did not cry. She simply hid her face and clenched both her fists till they ached. Through every stage of wounded love she passed, to the stages of anger. Her pride had undergone indignities, and when it came to share in the woundings of her heart, she was slowly making ready for reaction. It came at last as a heated resentment that tinged every nerve of her being. She was angry all through, and something superb was in her indignation. Nevertheless, she did not descend to the evening meal, but lay for an hour on the couch before she felt she could even light the gas and stand face to face with her mirror. When she did rise, she stood abruptly, charged all at once with a resolution splendid in its strength. She would not succumb. She would not permit her heart to ache to breaking. She would not permit the world to know that another college widow was to let. Galled in her pride by Gaylord's intimation that her origin was not on par with his own, smarted by a realization that something of his hint was doubtless true, and stung by the sense that as long as she remained a teacher of languages in this college town, she would be but a target for futile admiration and passing affairs. She resolved that everything would change and fate become her slave and not her master. A thoroughbred. Yes, she'd prove she was a thoroughbred. No pain of heart should lie upon her sleeve, no sallow cheek, no faded smile, no sunken eye or trembling lip should advertise her plight. She meant to laugh, to flirt, to sing, and then, in a week, or maybe even less, go down to New York, accept the offer made by Major Phipps, and deliberately undertake the task of forcing herself to the top. She knew not how such a thing could be achieved. She merely knew that it had been accomplished by others in the past, and she felt that, though 1,000 obstacles should loom across her path, she could find the strength in her outraged heart to meet and surmount them all. She lighted her gas. There on her bureau lay an envelope, and behind it stood a photograph of Gaylord, mutely gazing on her face. Tempted for a moment to catch it up and tear it into fragments, she altered her mind, opened the drawer, and swept it in, face downward, among a lot of empty bonbon boxes, faded roses and ribbons which had come with many of his favours. The envelope fell to the floor, and she bent and took it up. For a moment she glanced at it idly before she tore it apart. Then she knew what it was, an invitation, wrongly addressed and hence delayed, but sent 3 days before by Mrs. Clayton White, one of New Haven's newly rich, to the topsy-turvy ball at her home this present night. The ball was one to which women were privileged to invite male acquaintances of their choice. Not only did Thurley decide on the instant to attend, but she also determined to ask as her escort a hopeful admirer, good-natured Harry Shattuck, who alone of Gaylord's set had bested him at fencing and at chess. Colour leaped warmly to her face at the thought that Gaylord himself would almost certainly be at the ball. She glanced at the mirror, gave a few restoring sweeps to her hair, then ran to the door and down the stairs to the phone at the rear of the parlour. Shattuck responded across the wire in a spirit of youthful exultation. Not only was he free to go to the ball, but also he was wild to attend, and would call at 9 with his limousine car, and he knew they'd have a ripping time. Half an hour later Thurley was robing in her room with one of the girls of the house to dress her hair. She had swallowed a cold, belated dinner, but had never appeared more animated in her life. The light in her eyes was a flame of warming fire. The pride in the poise of her regal little head was the natural, unstudied outcome of her newly completed resolve. She was gowned at last in a shimmering pale green toilette, as flimsy as gossamer. It was cut only slightly décolleté, but with the marvellously contrasted colouring of her lips, brows, eyes, and hair, it made a startling combination of things irresistibly charming. Only a faint flush of rose tint played in the perfect oval of her face, a colour moving now toward her temples, now toward her chin, as if some zephyr wafted it thus about, as it wafts a changing tint upon a meadow. Shattuck arrived ahead of time, and his car softly purred at the gate. Then, when at length it was halted at the Clayton Whites, and Thurley and Shattuck alighted, the one thing possible to make her moment triumphantly complete actually had the grace to occur. Gaylord arrived with a little Miss Snow, driven in an ordinary cab, and there in the glare of a white electric arc a greeting was exchanged between the four. The smile and nod with which, apparently, so far as Thurley was concerned, the affair of the afternoon was dismissed. disconcerted Gaylord utterly. Indeed, the last person he expected to encounter here was Thurley Ruxton. Already his evening was beginning with a scowl. It was Thurley's hour. Never had any hour within her life been more thoroughly conceded to her queenship. Gaylord, unable to endure it longer, forced his way, as if by unsurrendered right, through the group to her side. She met his gaze and nodded brightly. "May I ask for your card?" he said, burning red to his ears. "I hope for a waltz, or two, or three." "Oh, there isn't one. Too bad," she said, smiling at him gaily. "Perhaps you could ask for an extra. Ask Mrs. White." "I will," he said. He did, and was granted his boon. Thurley danced with him gladly, and something that savoured of divinity and motion was generously bestowed upon her. Something possessed her to waltz in Gaylord's arms as she had never waltzed in her life. She led him to the brinks of new infatuation, all to hide the truth that for an hour he had crushed her like a rose beneath his feet. It appeared to all that nothing had been changed as they watched the pair together on the floor. Gaylord himself was bewildered, not only by her wonderful recovery, but far more than ever by her beauty. Some mad impatience to snatch back his ownership goaded his vanity anew. "Thurley," he said, looking down into her eyes, "I want one more of those waltzes. I've got to have 2 or 3 more." She laughed. "Oh, doesn't that sound like little Oliver Twist? Mustn't it be dreadful to want more mush, school mush, or college mush, especially when there isn't any more left?" He felt she was laughing at him, treating his wishes as a joke. "I didn't know you were coming here tonight," he said. "You might have invited me." "Oh, I thought you might be packing your trunk," she answered innocently. "I'm almost sure you said you were leaving tomorrow." He glared down at her half angrily. "You don't care," he said. "About what?" she answered. "Dancing? Oh, yes, I do. And that tall, ungamey-looking Billy Linkerton waltzes like a swallow. You'd never believe it in the world. He's a bifurcated poem. He glides like a jellyfish in cream. You'd as soon expect a ladder to attempt a minuet, but he really has a soul for rhythmic motion." She could think of nothing further to add to this frippery, and Gaylord, utterly incapable of comprehending her mood, and annoyed and piqued, relapsed into sullenness. To Thurley, in the moment that the waltz was ended, came ineffable relief. A dozen eager swains were presently swarming about her as before, and Gaylord could do nothing but retreat. Nevertheless, she was faint at heart, now that the worst of it was over. The dance with Gaylord had proved to be an ordeal taxing all her powers. She was weak, despite her air of buoyancy, and conscious always of a deep-lying hurt. By 12 o'clock, when her purpose was fulfilled, the reaction came upon her. Beginning to be physically exhausted, she found herself the ready prey of all the aches postponed by her artificial joys. Her game had been played, her triumph was complete, but she had barely the strength to meet the demands of her most exacting role through the process of making her escape. She left with Shattuck in his waiting car, and was taken directly home. A final sparkle of incandescence was conjured to her eyes in the smile she gave him at parting. Then, at last, she was once more alone in her room, sadly requiring rest. End chapter 3.